Mafia boss's baby cried continuously on the plane until an air hostess calmed her 30,000 feet in the air. The mafia boss's baby wouldn't stop crying until the air hostess bent down, whispered something in Italian, and the entire cabin went dead silent. The boss's hand froze midair. No one knew who she really was, or why his eyes suddenly filled with fear. Before we begin, please take a moment to support this channel by clicking the like, share, and subscribe button so you can keep enjoying awesome stories like this. Thank you. Romano Ferri sat rigid in first-class seat 1A of flight AZ607 to Rome, his tattooed hands trembling slightly, not from fear, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 20 years, but from pure exhaustion, as his 8-month-old daughter Damiana screamed with raw, grief-stricken desperation. For 3.5 relentless hours, every passenger on this transatlantic flight had been subjected to the heart-wrenching wailing that no amount of money, power, or thinly veiled threats could silence. This was a man whose mere name made politicians return bribes and rival criminals flee cities. A man who controlled half the shipping routes on the eastern seaboard and had never lost a negotiation. Yet here he sat, completely and utterly powerless against the cries of a mourning infant. Romano had tried everything his wealth could buy. He'd paced the aisles with Damiana pressed against his chest, her tiny body rigid with distress. He'd offered her imported organic formula from Europe, custom blended for sensitive stomachs. She'd rejected it violently, her screams intensifying. He'd presented designer toys that cost more than most passengers' monthly salaries, toys that lit up and played soothing melodies. Damiana batted them away with surprising force for someone so small. In a moment of desperation that surprised even him, Romano had played recordings of his late wife Maria's voice on his phone, hoping the familiar sound would comfort his daughter. Instead, Damiana's cries had reached a new pitch of anguish, as if she understood exactly what she'd lost. Nothing worked. The other first-class passengers had long stopped pretending to be understanding. In seat 2C, an investment banker kept checking his watch with theatrical sighs, loud enough to ensure Romano heard each one. In seat 3A, an elderly woman in expensive pearls had complained twice to the flight attendants about parents who have no business traveling with children they clearly can't control. Flight attendants approached Romano's seat with the cautious body language usually reserved for handling explosives, offering suggestions with professional smiles that couldn't hide their growing alarm about the disruption to other passengers, and perhaps their fear of the man himself. Even the pilot had made a pointed announcement about ensuring all passengers enjoy a comfortable journey, and Romano knew exactly who that message was meant for. But what truly unsettled Romano, more than the passengers' hostility, more than his own helplessness, was the presence of his two bodyguards, Marco and Vincent, seated strategically in 2A and 4A. These were men who had seen him handle situations that would make most people's blood run cold. These were men who had watched him negotiate million-dollar deals with the cold precision of a surgeon and resolve conflicts with swift, decisive action. Yet now, Marco and Vincent sat frozen, their usual competence rendered useless by an 8-month-old baby's inconsolable grief. Their discomfort was palpable, and Romano realized that nothing exposed weakness quite like being unable to comfort your own child. That's when something unthinkable happened. From the galley area where flight attendants had been whispering nervously for the past hour, a young woman emerged. She couldn't have been more than early 20s, her crisp uniform identifying her as one of the junior crew members. She walked steadily down the aisle toward first class with a purposeful stride that seemed utterly disconnected from the fear everyone else displayed in Romano's presence. Her supervisor, an older woman with steel-gray hair, reached out to grab her arm, hissing something urgent, but the young woman gently extracted herself and kept walking. She stopped directly beside Romano's seat, her warm hazel eyes meeting his bloodshot ones without flinching. Every other passenger on this plane had avoided eye contact with him for hours, but this girl, barely out of college by the look of her, stood before him with steady, professional compassion. "Mr. Ferri," she said quietly, her voice somehow cutting through Damiana's desperate wails. "May I try something?" Romano stared at her, his exhaustion-fogged mind struggling to process what was happening. He was a man accustomed to people keeping their distance, approaching only when summoned, speaking only when given permission. Yet here stood this young flight attendant, asking to help with a confidence that seemed impossible given who he was and what his reputation meant. He could see Marco shifting in his peripheral vision, ready to intervene, to protect Romano's space from this intrusion. But Romano was so exhausted, so desperate, so utterly defeated by hours of his daughter's suffering, that he didn't even question why a stranger, let alone a flight attendant barely older than a teenager, was offering to help. He simply nodded once, too tired and too broken to care about protocol, propriety, or maintaining the fearsome image that had defined him for 2 decades. What happened next seemed to defy logic and everything Romano understood about power and control. The moment the young woman's gentle hands made contact with Damiana, the screaming began to diminish. She lifted the baby with a practiced confidence that seemed impossible for someone her age, positioning her in a specific hold that Romano had never seen before, supporting Damiana's head and spine with one hand, while applying gentle, rhythmic pressure along her back with the other. Then she began to hum, a soft, melodic tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient, a lullaby that carried weight and comfort in equal measure. Damiana's anguished screams faded to desperate whimpering. Her searching, grief-stricken eyes that had been squeezed shut in distress for hours, slowly opened and focused on the young woman's face. The whimpering softened to hiccups. Then, impossibly, complete silence descended over the entire cabin. 200 passengers collectively held their breath, waiting to see if this impossible peace would last. The airplane's engines, which had been drowned out by Damiana's cries for hours, suddenly seemed deafeningly loud in the absence of her wailing. Even the flight attendants froze mid-movement, staring in disbelief at the scene unfolding in Seat 1A. For the first time since takeoff, for the first time in the 3 weeks since Maria's death, Damiana looked calm, peaceful, almost safe. Romano felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify because he'd spent so many years building walls against feeling anything at all. Then he realized, with a shock that left him momentarily breathless, that tears were forming in his eyes. He, Romano Ferri, who hadn't cried since he was a boy in Sicily, who had maintained perfect control through his wife's funeral, who had built an empire on the foundation of showing no weakness. He was crying. "How did you do that?" Romano whispered, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to process. He stared at this mysterious young woman who had accomplished in 30 seconds what he, with all his resources and desperation, couldn't achieve in 3.5 hours. The young woman looked up from Damiana, and Romano saw something in her eyes that he recognized immediately because he'd seen it in mirrors during his own childhood. The look of someone who had survived trauma and learned to transform that survival into purpose. "She's not sick, Mr. Ferri," the young woman said gently, continuing the soft back massage that kept Damiana calm. "She's grieving. She's looking for her mother." Those words hit Romano with more force than any physical blow he'd ever received. Because they were true, and because this stranger had recognized in minutes what he'd been unable to acknowledge for weeks. His daughter wasn't just crying. She was mourning. Romano looked around the first-class cabin and saw something that made his heart race with an unfamiliar mixture of disbelief and hope. Every single passenger was staring at them, but their expressions had transformed completely. The hostile businessman in 2C was watching with tears in his own eyes. The judgmental elderly woman had her hand pressed to her mouth, her pearl necklace rising and falling with emotion. Even Marco and Vincent had visible shock on their usually impassive faces. The collective mood had shifted from hostility to something Romano couldn't quite name. Amazement, perhaps, or gratitude that someone had finally brought peace to the cabin. But more than that, these strangers were witnessing something profound, a moment of pure human compassion cutting through wealth, power, and fear to reach a suffering child. "Approached you without. She stays," Romano interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. He gestured to the empty first-class seat beside him, Seat 1B. "Sit down." The supervisor opened her mouth to protest, perhaps about airline policy or professional boundaries, but one look at Romano's face, and more importantly, at Damiana's peaceful expression, made her close it again. She retreated with visible reluctance, throwing worried glances over her shoulder. The young woman, Teresa, he now knew her name was, hesitated for only a moment before settling into the seat beside him, still holding Damiana with that same practiced confidence. The baby, who hadn't peacefully accepted anyone's comfort since Maria's death, settled completely in this stranger's arms, her tiny fists uncurling, her breathing becoming deep and regular. "Tell me your name," Romano said quietly, though he'd already heard her supervisor say it. He needed to hear it from her, needed this moment to be real and not some exhaustion-induced hallucination. "Teresa," she replied, her voice calm and professional despite the extraordinary nature of what had just happened. "Teresa Pierce." "Tell me." "Teresa Pierce," Romano continued, his voice careful as he studied her with the same assessment skills that had made him successful in his dangerous profession. How does a flight attendant know advanced techniques for calming traumatized infants? And in that question, in the space between one answer and the next, neither Romano nor Teresa had any idea that this chance encounter at 35,000 feet was about to reveal two stories of survival, trauma, and desperate hope that would interweave in ways that would change both their lives and Damiana's future forever. Romano Ferri was a name whispered in certain circles, a name that carried weight in boardrooms and back alleys alike. At 38 years old, he controlled an empire built over 2 decades of careful calculation, strategic alliances, and ruthless efficiency. But the empire that had made him wealthy and feared couldn't help him with the crisis he faced now. He was traveling to Rome for reasons that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with grief. 45 minutes earlier, in the galley, Teresa G. Pierce stood at the galley counter, her hands mechanically preparing beverage orders while her mind focused on the desperate crying echoing from first class. This was only her second international flight. She was still technically in training, but her psychology coursework at NYU had taught her to recognize different types of infant distress. This wasn't colic. This wasn't hunger or discomfort. This was grief, raw and primal, the sound of a baby searching for someone who would never answer. "Stay away from 1A. Helen Crawford's sharp voice cut through her thoughts for the third time. Her supervisor's face was tight with anxiety. "Do you understand me? That man is Romano Ferri. Do you know what that name means?" Teresa did know. The other flight attendants had been whispering about the passenger in seat 1A since boarding, stories about organized crime, about violence, about a man whose name alone made people nervous. But all Teresa could hear was that baby's heartbroken cries, the same patterns she'd recognized countless times during her weekend shifts at St. Vincent's Crisis Center for Children. "He controls half the criminal operations on the East Coast," another attendant murmured, sliding past with empty glasses. "My cousin's a cop. He says Romano Ferri is someone you don't approach unless you have a death wish." Teresa's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her 16-year-old sister Emma. "Is he still looking for us?" Her chest tightened as she typed back quickly. "Stay inside today. Don't answer the door." 3 years of hiding her siblings from their abusive stepfather had taught Teresa to recognize danger in all its forms. But it had also taught her something else. That sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all when someone needs help. Another wave of Damiana's cries rolled through the cabin, and Teresa closed her eyes, transported momentarily to the crisis center, to 3-year-old Sophie, who'd witnessed her father's violence and cried with that same searching desperation until Teresa had held her with specific pressure techniques, humming the same lullaby her own mother had once sung before fear had silenced her voice forever. "Passenger in 3A is threatening to report the airline," another attendant announced, returning to the galley with a harried expression. "She says this is unacceptable." Through the galley curtain, Teresa watched the scene in first class. Romano Ferri's jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. His bodyguards, she'd clocked them immediately upon boarding, were exchanging concerned looks. One of them, a man built like a wall, had his hand positioned near his jacket in a way that made Teresa's survival instincts prickle. But it was Damiana's face that held her attention. The way the baby arched her back. The way her eyes searched the space around her father's shoulder, looking, always looking. The specific pitch of her cries that shifted between rage and despair. "That's not colic," Teresa whispered to herself. "That's grief. She's looking for her mother." And suddenly, Teresa wasn't thinking about Romano Ferri's reputation or Helen's warnings or even her own safety. She was thinking about every traumatized child she'd held at St. Vincent's, every little face that had looked at her with desperate hope that someone, anyone, understood their pain. She was thinking about Emma and Tyler, hiding in a safe house because Teresa had chosen to risk everything to protect them. She was thinking about the night she'd escaped her stepfather Frank's house with her siblings, knowing that doing nothing would have been more dangerous than running. Her psychology professor's words echoed in her mind. Trauma in infancy doesn't just cause crying. It causes searching behavior. The child is looking for the primary caregiver who provided safety. When that person is gone, the infant enters a state of prolonged protest that can cause lasting psychological damage if not addressed. Damiana needed someone who understood trauma. And whether Romano Ferri was a mafia boss or a saint, his daughter needed help that he clearly didn't know how to provide. Helen's hand gripped Teresa's arm as she moved toward the galley curtain. I'm telling you one last time, stay away from that man. You want to throw away your career over a crying baby. Teresa met her supervisor's eyes and saw fear there, but also the exhaustion of someone who'd spent a lifetime playing it safe, avoiding risks, never stepping outside the boundaries of what was acceptable and comfortable. I want to help a traumatized child, Teresa said quietly, extracting her arm from Helen's grip. Everything else is secondary. She pushed through the curtain and walked steadily down the aisle toward first class, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Every passenger who noticed her approach looked away quickly, as if afraid to be associated with someone breaking an unspoken rule. You don't approach Romano Ferri unless summoned. But Teresa had spent 3 years breaking rules to protect the people she loved. What was one more? Teresa was about to risk everything. Her job, possibly her safety, certainly her supervisor's wrath, for a baby she'd never met. But here's what most people never realize. The moments that define our entire lives often come disguised as impossible choices. The difference between those who change the world and those who watch it happen is simply this: the willingness to act when everyone else stays frozen in fear. Don't miss what happens when Teresa's courage collides with Romano's desperation. Subscribe now, because this next moment will prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is nothing at all. She stopped beside seat 1A, her professional smile firmly in place despite the way her pulse raced. Romano Ferri looked up at her with bloodshot eyes that held exhaustion, frustration, and something else she recognized immediately from her own mirror: helplessness. Mr. Ferri, she said quietly, her voice somehow cutting through Damiana's cries. May I try something? Romano Ferri stared at the young flight attendant standing before him, and for a moment, his exhaustion-fogged mind couldn't process what was happening. Everyone on this plane had been avoiding him for hours. Even the crew approached with visible fear. Yet here stood this girl, barely out of college, asking permission to help with a confidence that seemed impossible given who he was. His instincts, honed through 20 years of reading people for survival, kicked in automatically. He studied her face, searching for the telltale signs he'd learned to recognize: the calculated manipulation of someone seeking favor, the reckless bravado of someone trying to prove something, the trembling uncertainty of fear masked as courage. But he found none of those things. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him more than any threat. Genuine concern focused entirely on Damiana, not on him. She wasn't afraid. Not in the way everyone else was afraid. In his peripheral vision, Romano saw Marco rising slightly from his seat, his hand moving toward his jacket in the automatic protective gesture that had kept Romano alive through countless dangerous encounters. Romano raised his hand in a subtle gesture, stand down, and Marco froze, though his eyes remained locked on Teresa with professional suspicion. Around the cabin, passengers who'd been pretending to sleep or work suddenly found reasons to glance toward seat 1A. Romano recognized the expressions: surprise that anyone would approach him, skepticism that a flight attendant could accomplish what hours of his efforts had failed to achieve, and perhaps a hint of morbid curiosity about how he'd react to this intrusion. Helen Crawford rushed forward, her face flushed with professional anxiety. I apologize, Mr. Ferri, she began, her voice tight and high-pitched. Teresa shouldn't have approached you without proper. Let her try, Romano interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. His arms ached from hours of holding Damiana's rigid, distressed body. His head pounded from the relentless crying. His heart hurt in ways he didn't know how to name. Nothing else has worked. Helen opened her mouth to protest, perhaps about airline policy or liability or any number of regulations that suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of his daughter's suffering. But one look at Romano's face, and the desperate hope barely visible beneath his exhaustion, made her step back, though not without shooting Teresa a look that promised consequences later. Teresa moved forward with practiced efficiency, her hands already positioned to receive Damiana. "May I?" she asked softly, and Romano found himself nodding, extending his daughter toward this stranger with a surrender that would have been unthinkable hours ago. The moment Teresa's hands made contact with Damiana, something shifted in the air. Romano watched, transfixed, as Teresa positioned his daughter in a hold he'd never seen before, supporting Damiana's head and spine with her left hand while her right hand rested gently along the baby's back. It wasn't the typical cradle hold or over-the-shoulder position. This was something specific, purposeful, the kind of technique that came from training rather than instinct. Then Teresa began applying gentle pressure along Damiana's spine, her fingers moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Simultaneously, she started humming, a soft, melodic lullaby that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and comforting, a sound that carried weight beyond its simple notes. Damiana's desperate screaming didn't stop immediately, but it changed. The pitch shifted from anguished protest to something softer, questioning. Her rigid body began to relax incrementally, her arched back slowly settling against Teresa's supporting hand. Romano's breath caught in his throat. The screaming faded to loud whimpering. Damiana's eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress for what felt like an eternity, slowly opened. But instead of the unfocused, searching gaze that had been breaking Romano's heart for weeks, his daughter's eyes fixed directly on Teresa's face with sudden, startling attention. The whimpering softened to hiccuping breaths. Damiana's tiny fists, which had been clenched so tight Romano had worried she'd hurt herself, gradually uncurled. Her searching, desperate movements stilled. Then, impossibly, silence descended. Complete, absolute, miraculous silence. The airplane cabin, which had been filled with Damiana's cries for 3.5 hours, suddenly became so quiet that Romano could hear the hum of the engines, the soft rustle of passengers shifting in their seats, the barely audible whisper of the air circulation system. 200 people collectively held their breath, as if afraid that any sound might shatter this fragile peace. Damiana's chest rose and fell with deep, steady breaths. Her eyes remained focused on Teresa's face, but the frantic, searching quality was gone, replaced by something Romano hadn't seen in his daughter since before Maria's death. Calm recognition, the beginning of trust. Romano felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation so unfamiliar he didn't immediately recognize it. His vision blurred slightly, and with a shock that left him momentarily breathless, he realized tears were forming in his eyes. He, Romano Ferri, who hadn't cried since he was a boy in Sicily, who had maintained perfect control through his wife's funeral, who had built an empire on the foundation of showing no weakness, felt tears threatening to fall. He blinked hard, trying to regain control, but the image before him made that impossible. His baby daughter, peaceful for the first time in weeks, cradled in the arms of a stranger who had accomplished in minutes what all his power and resources couldn't achieve in hours. "How did you do that?" Romano whispered, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to process. Teresa looked up from Damiana, her hazel eyes meeting his with gentle understanding. Infants who've experienced sudden loss exhibit specific trauma responses, she explained quietly, her voice carrying the careful professionalism of someone with training. The crying pattern, the way she was arching her back, her searching eye movements, these aren't signs of colic or physical discomfort. They're grief responses. She adjusted Damiana slightly, maintaining the supportive hold while continuing the gentle back pressure. "She's not sick, Mr. Ferri. She's grieving. She's looking for her mother." Those words hit Romano with more force than any physical blow he'd ever received in his violent career. Because they were true. Because in 3 weeks of desperate attempts to comfort Damiana, he'd been treating symptoms while ignoring the wound beneath. His daughter wasn't misbehaving or difficult. She was mourning someone she couldn't name, but whose absence she felt with devastating clarity. Romano's jaw clenched as he fought against the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He looked away from Teresa's compassionate gaze and found himself facing the cabin full of passengers who'd witnessed this entire exchange. The transformation in their faces was startling. The investment banker in 2C, who'd been checking his watch with theatrical annoyance for hours, was watching with visible tears in his eyes. The elderly woman in pearls, who'd complained about irresponsible parents, had her hand pressed to her mouth, her own eyes glistening. Even the flight attendants clustered near the galley were staring with expressions of wonder. The hostile atmosphere that had been building for hours had evaporated, replaced by something Romano couldn't quite name. Awe, perhaps, or gratitude that someone had finally understood what this baby needed. Or maybe they were simply witnessing something profound. The exact moment when compassion cut through every barrier of wealth, power, and fear to reach a suffering child. Marco and Vincent, his bodyguards who'd seen him handle situations that would make most people's blood run cold, wore expressions of complete shock. Marco's hand had dropped away from his jacket, his usual vigilance temporarily forgotten in the face of what he'd just witnessed. Romano turned back to Teresa and Damiana. His daughter's eyes were beginning to flutter closed, her breathing deepening into the rhythm of approaching sleep. Peaceful sleep, not the exhausted collapse that had been the only respite from crying for weeks. "Sit," Romano said quietly, gesturing to the empty first-class seat beside him, seat 1B. It wasn't a request. Helen Crawford made a small sound of protest. "Mr. Ferry, airline policy requires that crew members—" "She stays here," Romano interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He didn't look at Helen, didn't acknowledge her concern. His entire attention was focused on Teresa and the miracle she'd just performed. "With me. With my daughter." Helen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She shot Teresa a look that combined shock, disapproval, and perhaps a hint of something else. Maybe envy that her junior crew member had just accomplished something extraordinary, or maybe fear about what explanations would be required when they landed. But Romano's tone left no room for argument, and after a moment of internal struggle visible on her face, Helen retreated down the aisle, her spine rigid with disapproval. Teresa hesitated for only a heartbeat before settling into seat 1B, adjusting her position carefully to maintain Damiana's comfort. The baby, who hadn't accepted anyone's care since Maria's death, settled completely in this stranger's arms. Her tiny fingers, which had been clutching desperately at Romano's shirt for hours, now rested peacefully against Teresa's uniform. Her face, which had been contorted with distress, smoothed into the serene expression of approaching sleep. Romano watched his daughter drift off, and for the first time in 3 weeks, the knot of panic that had been lodged in his chest loosened slightly. Damiana was sleeping, truly sleeping, not crying herself into unconscious exhaustion. The peace on her face was real. As Damiana's breathing deepened into true sleep, Romano found himself studying Teresa with the assessment skills that had kept him alive in a dangerous profession. Now that his daughter was calm, his mind could process details he'd missed in his exhaustion. The competence in Teresa's movements, the professional knowledge beneath her youth, the hint of something deeper in her eyes, a shadow that suggested she understood trauma not just academically, but personally. "Tell me your name," Romano said quietly, though he'd already heard her supervisor say it. He needed to hear it from her, needed to make this moment real. "Teresa," she replied, her voice soft to avoid disturbing the sleeping baby. "Teresa Pierce." "Tell me." "Teresa Pierce," Romano continued, his voice careful as he studied her face. "How does a flight attendant know advanced techniques for calming traumatized infants?" Teresa hesitated before answering Romano's question. Around them, the cabin had finally settled into peaceful quiet, passengers drifting off to sleep now that Damiana was calm. But Romano's dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made it clear he wasn't asking out of casual curiosity. He was assessing her, reading her, the way a man in his position learned to read everyone. "I'm a psychology student at NYU," Teresa said carefully, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Damiana. "Specializing in childhood trauma. I volunteer weekends at St. Vincent's Crisis Center for Children in Brooklyn. I work 3 jobs to afford tuition: flight attendant, the crisis center, and overnight security at my dorm." Romano's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression thoughtful. That's an impressive resume for someone your age. But that's not what I asked. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. You didn't learn this from books. You learned it from experience. Personal experience. Teresa felt her breath catch. She'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of deflection, of sharing just enough truth to satisfy curiosity without revealing the wounds beneath. But Romano Ferri wasn't someone who accepted surface answers. My childhood was difficult, she admitted quietly, her arms tightening protectively around Damiana. I understand what it means to survive trauma, to learn how to recognize it in others. Something shifted in Romano's expression, not pity, but recognition. Then we have that in common. Survival. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Two people separated by wealth and power, in completely different worlds, connected by the understanding that only survivors share, that the past never really leaves you. It just teaches you how to carry it differently. Romano looked down at his sleeping daughter, his tattooed hands flexing as if remembering how useless they'd been for the past 3 hours. I'm traveling to Rome because Maria's funeral was 3 weeks ago. My wife, Damiana's mother. His voice was carefully controlled, but Teresa heard the emotion beneath it. She was buried in her family plot in Sicily. There were arrangements that needed to be made. I'm sorry, Teresa said, meaning it. It was a car bombing, Romano continued, his jaw tightening. Meant for me. A message from rivals who thought they could force my hand in certain business negotiations. Maria was supposed to be at her mother's house that afternoon. She changed her plans at the last minute. He paused, his eyes fixed on Damiana's peaceful face. The car seat saved my daughter's life, but it couldn't save her mother. Teresa felt tears prick her eyes as she looked down at the baby sleeping in her arms. She was in the car when it happened? In the back seat, protected by the structure of the vehicle. Not a scratch on her physically. Romano's voice was hollow. But 3 weeks ago, she had a mother. And now she's searching for someone who will never answer. And He stopped, his control slipping for just a moment. I've built an empire on fear and power. I can manage complex operations across multiple countries. But I can't figure out how to help my own daughter stop crying. Teresa recognized the particular kind of pain in his voice, the helplessness of watching someone you love suffer and being unable to fix it. She'd heard it in her own voice when her brother Tyler had nightmares about their stepfather, when her sister Emma flinched at loud noises, when she'd realized that escaping abuse was just the beginning of healing, not the end. Infants who experience sudden loss exhibit specific grief responses, Teresa explained gently, shifting into the professional knowledge that felt safer than emotion. Damiana's crying pattern, her body language, her searching movements, these are all signs of attachment disruption. She's too young to understand death conceptually, but she knows her mother is gone. Every cry is her asking, where is she? Every moment of calm that gets disrupted makes her ask again. Romano's face contorted with pain at those words. Traditional soothing techniques don't work because you're trying to fix a physical problem when the wound is emotional, Teresa continued. What she needs is consistent, calm presence from someone who understands trauma. Someone who can hold her grief without trying to make it disappear. Like you just did, Romano said quietly. Like I just did, Teresa confirmed. But it's not a one-time fix. Healing from this kind of trauma takes time, consistency, patience. Romano nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through something. Then he turned to face her fully, his expression shifting into what Teresa recognized as his business demeanor, still emotional, but now purposeful. I have meetings in Rome for the next week, he said. Business that can't be postponed. Legal matters related to Maria's estate, among other things. He paused. My previous nanny quit 2 days after the bombing. Too afraid to stay associated with my family. Teresa felt her stomach tighten, sensing where this was going. I want to hire you as Damiana's caregiver. 1 week in Rome. Name your price. Mr. Ferri, I have a job, Teresa began. $8,000 for the week. Romano interrupted, his voice matter of fact. Private accommodations in my penthouse. All expenses paid. Full access to anything you or Damiana might need. Teresa's mind reeled. $8,000. That was 3 months' rent for the safe house where Emma and Tyler were hiding. That was Emma's college application fees for every school she dreamed of attending. That was 6 months of therapy sessions for Tyler. That was breathing room, safety, time. But it was also entering the world of Romano Ferry, a world where car bombs killed innocent people, a world where rivals sent messages through violence, a world that her every instinct told her to avoid. Teresa started, her thoughts tumbling over each other. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another text from Emma. She glanced at it quickly. The locks on the safe house are old. I think someone tried the door last night. Terry, I'm scared. Frank was still looking for them, still hunting. And Teresa was still barely keeping her siblings safe on a patchwork of part-time jobs and student loans. She looked down at Damiana, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. Then at Romano, whose dangerous reputation couldn't hide the desperate love of a father who'd lost everything except his daughter. Mr. Ferry, I need to think. Romano, he interrupted gently. If you're going to help save my daughter, call me Romano. Teresa faced an impossible choice. Accept money from a mafia boss that could save her family, or walk away and protect her moral boundaries. But here's what she didn't know yet. Sometimes the most dangerous choice isn't accepting help from a dangerous man. Sometimes it's refusing help when your family's survival depends on it. What happens next will show you why we can never judge desperate decisions from the comfort of safety. Hit subscribe now, because you need to see how this choice leads to consequences no one could have predicted. Before Teresa could answer, Damiana stirred in her arms, making soft sounds. The baby's eyes fluttered but didn't fully open, her tiny hand reaching out instinctively. Romano watched his daughter with an expression that broke Teresa's heart. Not just love, but desperation. The look of someone who'd do anything to protect the one person he had left. Romano. Teresa began carefully, testing the name on her tongue. I need to be honest with you. I don't know anything about your world. And what I do know suggests that entering it, even temporarily, could be dangerous, Romano finished. I know. Believe me, I know better than anyone. He looked at her directly. But I also know that what you did for Damiana in the last 30 minutes, no one else has been able to do in 3 weeks. Not trained professionals. Not expensive specialists. You. From 3 rows back in first class, a man stood up. Teresa noticed him peripherally, mid-40s, expensive suit that somehow didn't fit quite right, his movement too purposeful for someone simply heading to the restroom. Marco noticed too. His entire body went rigid, his hand moving subtly toward his jacket with practiced ease. Vincent, seated across the aisle, shifted position almost imperceptibly, creating a barrier between the approaching man and Romano. The temperature in the cabin changed. Teresa felt it like a physical presence, tension crackling through the air, the kind of danger that her survival instincts had learned to recognize during 3 years of hiding from her stepfather. The man walking toward them smiled, but his eyes were cold. Marco rose smoothly from his seat, his movement casual, but his eyes locked on the approaching passenger, a man in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit that didn't quite fit right, his hands visible, but his posture wrong. Vincent shifted position from across the aisle, creating a subtle barrier between the stranger and Romano. Teresa felt the temperature in the cabin change, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Excuse me, Mr. Ferry? The man's voice was pleasant, almost friendly. I thought that was you. Romano's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The vulnerable father disappeared, replaced by something harder, colder. Castellano, he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning. You're a long way from your usual territory. Teresa's instincts, honed through years of recognizing predatory behavior in her stepfather, started screaming warnings. She noticed details that others might miss. How the man's eyes kept flicking to Damiana sleeping in her arms, how his smile didn't reach his eyes, how his gait was too controlled, like someone ready to move quickly. And there, near the galley, a crew member she didn't recognize watching the interaction with unusual intensity. Such a beautiful baby, Castellano said, his gaze lingering on Damiana in a way that made Teresa's skin crawl. Such a shame about your wife. Tragic accident. Return to your seat, Romano said, his voice dropping to a tone that promised violence. I just wanted to pay my respects. Castellano's hand moved slightly toward his jacket. And to remind you that debts always get paid, one way or another. Marco and Vincent closed in, but Teresa moved faster. Her arms tightened protectively around Damiana as she hit the flight attendant call button repeatedly. 3 short bursts, the emergency signal. Simultaneously, she stood, positioning her body between the sleeping baby and Castellano. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately," Teresa said, her voice carrying the authority of her position. "You're creating a disturbance." Helen and 2 other attendants rushed forward, drawn by the emergency signal and the obvious tension. Castellano calculated quickly. Too many witnesses now, too much attention. His smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Enjoy Rome, Fairy," he said, stepping back. "Beautiful city. Lots of accidents happen there." Marco followed him back to his seat while Vincent pulled out his phone, speaking rapid Italian into it, clearly calling ahead to contacts in Rome. The threat had passed, but the message had been delivered. Romano turned to Teresa, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before: defeat. "This is my life," he said quietly, his voice rough. "This is what I'm bringing my daughter up in. The car bombing that killed Maria, it was meant for me. Now they're targeting Damiana as leverage." He reached for his daughter, but Teresa noticed how his hands trembled slightly. "She's not safe with me, but I can't let her go. She's all I have left." "You're trying to leave," Teresa said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why they're escalating." Romano nodded. "They won't let me walk away. In my world, people don't retire, they die or get arrested." He looked at her with exhausted honesty. "You should leave. Get off this plane in Rome and forget you ever met us." Teresa looked down at Damiana, sleeping peacefully despite the danger swirling around her. She thought of Emma and Tyler, hiding in a safe house with old locks, terrified that Frank would find them. She understood what it meant to be a child caught in adult violence, to need protection from threats you didn't create. "I'll take the job," she heard herself say. 1 week in Rome. But not just as a nanny. Romano's eyebrows rose. "What do you mean? Damiana doesn't just need someone to feed her and change her diapers. She needs someone who understands trauma. Someone who can help her feel safe when her world isn't safe." Teresa took a breath. "But I need something too. My siblings and I are hiding from someone dangerous. My abusive stepfather. If I'm entering your world, I need to know you can keep all of us safe." Romano studied her face for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "You have my protection. All 3 of you. No one touches you or your family while you're under my care." As Teresa shook Romano's hand, sealing their dangerous bargain, she didn't see James, the crew member near the galley, quietly texting someone. "Target confirmed. Fairy has new caregiver for the child. Young female. Will complicate extraction. Advise." Leonardo da Vinci. Fiumicino Airport shimmered in the early morning Italian sun as Flight AZ-607 touched down. Teresa, still holding a sleeping Damiana, looked out the window at the ancient city sprawling beneath them and wondered if she'd just made the best or worst decision of her life. Beside her, Romano was already on his phone, speaking rapid Italian to someone about security protocols and sweep the penthouse again. The moment they entered the gate area, Teresa's reality shifted completely. Marco and Vincent flanked them immediately, joined by 4 additional men in dark suits who appeared as if summoned. They moved through a private exit she hadn't known existed, bypassing customs, baggage claim, the normal chaos of international arrivals. Airport officials nodded deferentially to Romano, their eyes sliding away from direct contact, as if looking at him too long might be dangerous. "Teresa," Helen's voice cut through the efficient procession. Her supervisor stood near the crew exit, her face a mixture of shock and concern. "What are you doing? This is insane." "I'm helping a child who needs me," Teresa replied quietly, adjusting Damiana in her arms. "You're making a terrible mistake," Helen hissed, low enough that Romano's security wouldn't hear. "You have no idea what you're getting into." "Maybe not," Teresa admitted, "but I know what I'm getting her out of." She nodded toward Damiana, still sleeping peacefully. Helen's expression shifted from anger to something like pity. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The drive through Rome was surreal. Luxury sedan with tinted windows, Marco driving while Vincent sat in front, constantly scanning their surroundings. Romano made phone calls in Italian, his voice alternating between commanding and concerned. Teresa watched the ancient city pass by, feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life. The penthouse took her breath away. Overlooking the Colosseum, it was luxury beyond anything she'd imagined. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture that probably cost more than her yearly tuition. Staff waited in the entrance. A housekeeper named Julia, a chef named Antonio, and 2 additional security personnel whose names she immediately forgot. Damiana's nursery, Romano said, leading her down a hallway. The room was perfect. Soft colors, expensive crib, every baby item imaginable already arranged. And your suite. He opened an adjoining door to reveal a bedroom larger than her entire apartment in New York, with its own bathroom, featuring marble and gold fixtures. This is too much, Teresa breathed. Everything you and Damiana need is here, Romano said, his demeanor shifting from dangerous boss to concerned father. If there's anything else, just ask. After the staff departed, Romano showed her the security protocol. Panic buttons throughout the apartment. Marco stationed outside 24/7. No one enters without Romano's approval. You're safe here, he said firmly. But you don't leave without escort. Teresa felt the walls of the luxury penthouse closing in slightly. I'm not used to being confined. You're not confined. You're protected. Romano's voice softened. There's a difference. One keeps you trapped. The other keeps you alive. Later, in the nursery with Damiana sleeping in her new crib, Romano asked the question Teresa had been dreading. Tell me about your stepfather. She took a breath. My mother married Frank Pierce when I was 12. It started with verbal abuse, yelling, insults, making her feel worthless. Then it escalated to physical violence. By the time Emma was born, he was... She paused, the memory sharp. He was dangerous. When he started threatening the younger children, I knew we had to leave. Your mother? Too afraid. Or too broken by then. I don't know. Teresa's voice caught. When I turned 19, I took Emma and Tyler. We left in the middle of the night with whatever we could carry. We've been hiding for 3 years. He's still looking for us. He'll never stop. Romano's jaw tightened. Now he has a reason to stop. Give me his information. Teresa hesitated, understanding the implications. What will you do? I said I'd protect you. I meant it. But I need to know what we're dealing with. I don't want him hurt, Teresa said quickly. I just want him to leave us alone. Romano's smile was dark, but not unkind. There are many ways to make a man understand boundaries without violence. Trust me, by the end of this week, your stepfather will never bother you again. You have my word. For the first time, Teresa began to understand the scope of power she'd connected herself to. It was terrifying and, she had to admit, also a relief. Damiana woke peacefully for the first time in weeks, accepting a bottle from Teresa without the desperate distress that had characterized her feeding times. Romano watched with visible relief and something else in his eyes, hope. She trusts you, he said quietly. She hasn't trusted anyone since Maria died. Consistency, Teresa explained, implementing the structured routine she'd learned at the crisis center. Traumatized children need predictability. The same person, the same responses, the same comfort. It helps them feel safe when their world isn't safe. As evening fell over Rome, painting the Colosseum in golden light visible through the nursery windows, Teresa rocked Damiana while Romano watched from the doorway. His face held an expression she was beginning to recognize, vulnerability beneath the dangerous exterior. Teresa, he said quietly, I want to tell you something. After Maria died, I thought the only way to protect Damiana was to be harder, more feared, more powerful. But watching you with her today, I'm beginning to think I was wrong about everything. Over the next 3 days, an unexpected routine developed in the Roman penthouse. Romano's business meetings took place in the mornings, video conferences with lawyers and accountants in his home office, while Teresa cared for Damiana. But the afternoons became something neither of them had anticipated. Romano's education in actually being present as a father. No, support her head like this, Teresa instructed gently, adjusting Romano's hands as he held Damiana. Feel how she relaxes when you're confident? Babies sense hesitation. Romano, a man who commanded criminal empires with absolute authority, fumbled with a diaper change while Marco and Vincent tried unsuccessfully to hide their amusement from their posts outside the nursery door. How is this harder than negotiating multi-million-dollar deals? He muttered. Because deals don't squirm, Teresa replied with a smile. And they don't pee on you mid-change. But slowly, awkwardness transformed into genuine engagement. Romano learned to read Damiana's different cries, hunger versus tiredness versus overstimulation. He mastered feeding techniques that didn't rush her. He discovered that skin-to-skin contact during afternoon naps made his daughter's breathing steady and peaceful. During Damiana's nap times, Romano's vulnerability emerged in quiet conversations. "I was barely present during Maria's pregnancy," he admitted one afternoon, staring out at the Colosseum. "Too busy with business, building the empire." His jaw tightened. "Maria warned me before she died. She said, 'This life will consume everything good, Romano. Even our daughter.' Is that why you're trying to leave?" Teresa asked. Romano nodded. "I've been moving assets, establishing legal businesses, shipping company, restaurants, real estate, preparing my exit. But my enemies see it as weakness. The Castellanos are trying to force me back in or eliminate me entirely. In my world, people don't retire," he continued. "They die or get arrested. I'm trying to find a third option." Teresa watched him with professional insight. "Damiana's not just grieving her mother anymore. She's learning to trust again. Because of you." "Because of you," Romano corrected. "Because of consistency," Teresa said firmly. "Damiana doesn't need a powerful father. She needs a present father. And that's what you're becoming." Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, Vincent stood in a dingy apartment in Queens, showing Frank Pierce photographs. Drug dealing, assault charges, witness intimidation. His voice was cold. "The Pierce children are under protection now. If you attempt contact, this evidence goes to federal prosecutors. Understand?" Frank's face went pale. He understood exactly what Romano Ferri's protection meant. Back in Rome, the breakthrough came on the third afternoon. Romano made silly faces at Damiana, something he'd never imagined himself doing, and she giggled. The sound filled the nursery like music, the first true joy since Maria's death. Romano's eyes filled with tears. "She sounds like Maria when she laughed." "She's allowed to be happy again," Teresa said gently, placing her hand on his arm. "So are you." Romano's carefully constructed walls finally cracked. "I don't know how to do this. Any of this." "No one does at first," Teresa replied. "You just keep showing up. That's all children really need." As Romano began to believe redemption might actually be possible, he had no idea that his enemies had already made their move. While he was learning to be a father, they were planning to take everything from him, including the only two people he'd let himself care about since Maria's death. What happens next will show you that the moment we finally let ourselves hope is often the moment when everything we love is most at risk. Subscribe now, because the confrontation that's coming will test whether a man can truly leave his past behind, or if the past always collects its debts in blood. On the fourth evening, as Teresa prepared Damiana for bed, Romano's phone rang. She watched his face go dark as he listened, his body language shifting back into the dangerous man she'd first met on the plane. When he hung up, he turned to her with an expression that chilled her blood. "My meeting tomorrow. The one where I announce my exit to the families. The Castellanos are planning something. My sources say they're bringing muscle from New York." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to touch Damiana's sleeping face. "I want you and Damiana to stay here. Don't leave the penthouse under any circumstances." The next morning dawned gray and threatening over Rome, storm clouds gathering over the ancient city like an omen. Teresa fed Damiana breakfast in the penthouse kitchen while Marco stood at his usual position by the door, unusually tense. Romano had left at dawn for his meeting at Hotel Hassler, where the city's family heads would gather to hear his formal declaration of intent to leave the organization. Damiana sensed the tension, becoming fussier than she'd been in days. Teresa held her close, humming the lullaby that usually worked, but the baby squirmed restlessly. Marco's phone rang. He answered in rapid Italian, his expression darkening with each word. Then Vincent burst through the door, his usual composure shattered. "There's been a development." "It was a setup," Marco said, his voice tight. "The meeting was an ambush. Romano and his men are under siege at the hotel." Before Teresa could process this, an explosion rocked the building. The penthouse windows rattled. Alarms shrieked. Through the chaos, she heard shouting in the lobby below. The Castellanos were hitting the building simultaneously. "The panic room," Marco shouted, grabbing Teresa's arm. But when he punched in the code, the door wouldn't open. His face went pale. "Someone betrayed us. The code's been changed." Teresa's survival instincts, honed through years of fleeing her stepfather, kicked in immediately. She grabbed Damiana and the emergency bag she'd kept packed, a habit from her years in hiding. The service entrance, Vincent said, already moving. The catacombs beneath the building connect to the ancient underground. Go. We'll slow them down. Marco pressed a gun into Teresa's hand. If anyone comes at you. I know, Teresa said, though she'd never held a weapon in her life. She ran. The ancient tunnels beneath Rome were dark, cold, endless. Damiana cried, and Teresa used every calming technique she knew while her phone's flashlight cast dancing shadows on stone walls that had stood for millennia. Behind her, she heard pursuit, footsteps echoing, voices calling in Italian. She emerged, gasping, in an ancient church basement. An elderly priest found her there, took one look at her terrified face and the crying baby, and understood immediately. Sanctuary, Father Antonio said simply. You need sanctuary. Meanwhile, at Hotel Hassler, Romano fought his way through the ambush with cold efficiency that reminded everyone present who he really was. His single-minded focus, Damiana. I need to get to my daughter. He raced back to find the penthouse ransacked, Teresa and Damiana gone. Marco, wounded and bleeding, gasped. She ran. The catacombs. Sir, I don't know if she made it. Romano's unleashed fury flooded Rome's underground with his men, searching. Hours later, through street camera tracking, they located the church. Romano burst in, and seeing Teresa and Damiana safe, his mask fell completely. But Teresa's eyes blazed with anger. This is the life you wanted to save her from? She almost died today. I know, Romano said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. But Damiana reached for him, and Romano understood what Teresa saw. His daughter still trusted him, still needed him. You should leave, he said. Take the money and go. I'll make sure you're safe, far from all of this. Teresa looked at Damiana's face, calm despite the chaos, secure between them. She's healing. If I leave now, she loses another person she trusts. That will damage her worse than anything the Castellanos could do. She met his eyes. But you need to choose. Really choose. Not just say you're leaving. Actually leave it. Romano turned to Father Antonio. I need your help. I want to confess. When he emerged from confession, his face had changed. I've spent 20 years building an empire on fear. Today I'm walking away from all of it. Completely. As they prepared to leave under heavy guard, Teresa's phone rang. Emma's voice was shaken. Terry, Frank showed up. But there were men there. They said they worked for someone named Ferry. They made him leave. What's going on? Teresa looked at Romano, who nodded. I'm in Rome, she told her sister. And everything's about to change. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of a restored farmhouse in Tuscany, 50 miles from Rome, as Damiana took her first wobbly steps across the terrace. Teresa knelt with arms outstretched, encouraging her, while Romano watched from a chair, a smile transforming his usually stern face. This was a different man than the one who'd boarded that plane nearly half a year ago, softer somehow, though no less formidable. Romano's complete exit from organized crime had been brutal but successful. His cooperation with federal prosecutors had dismantled what he'd spent 20 years building. The Castellano family leadership sat in prison following coordinated raids. Romano's legitimate businesses, shipping, restaurants, real estate, thrived under new management. Damiana now carried her mother's maiden name, Rossi, for protection. Teresa had transformed too. No longer just a nanny, she was Damiana's legal co-guardian, completing her doctorate online while caring for the child who'd changed everything. Emma and Tyler lived safely in a nearby cottage, Emma applying to universities in Italy, Tyler finally receiving consistent therapy. Frank Pierce served 5 years for drug trafficking, courtesy of Romano's evidence. The threat that had haunted Teresa for years was finally neutralized. Damiana, now 14 months old, thrived. She called Teresa Tessa and Romano Papa, showing no trauma symptoms. The grief-stricken baby from the plane was now joyful and secure. But between Romano and Teresa, unspoken tension built. Shared parenting created intimacy, hands brushing while feeding Damiana, long conversations after she slept. Neither addressed it directly. Too complicated. Too risky. The Maria Ferry Crisis Center for Children neared completion in Rome. Romano's redemption project funding Teresa's dream. Comprehensive care for children escaping domestic violence and trauma, combining his resources with her expertise. Opening scheduled for next month. One evening on the terrace, after putting Damiana to bed, Romano broke the silence. I need to ask you something important. Teresa's heart raced. Finally, he was going to address their feelings. I want to formally adopt Damiana, he said instead. Make it legal and permanent. She's your daughter, Teresa replied, hiding her disappointment. Of course you should. But I want you as her co-guardian. Legally. Officially. Romano's dark eyes held hers. If something happens to me, I need to know she's with someone who loves her. Someone who understands her trauma. Someone she trusts completely. Romano, that's forever, Teresa whispered. I know. I'm asking you to bind yourself to us. To her. To me. Permanently. The weight of what he was really asking settled between them. Yes, Teresa said, tears forming. She's already mine in every way that matters. This just makes it official. Romano stood, moving to the terrace railing overlooking the Tuscan hills. There's something else I need to say. Something I should have said months ago. Teresa joined him, silent, listening. When you walked up to me on that plane, I was at my lowest point. I'd failed at everything that mattered. Keeping Maria safe, comforting my daughter, being anything other than a man people feared. His voice roughened. You showed me that strength isn't about power or control. It's about showing up when things are impossible and choosing compassion over self-preservation. He turned to face her. Somewhere along the way, while you were teaching me to be a father, you became the only person besides Damiana that I can't imagine living without. I'm not asking for anything. I know I have no right to. I just needed you to know that you saved us both. Teresa's breath caught. When I first approached you, I was terrified. Not because of your reputation, but because I knew that helping Damiana would change everything. And it did. Her hand found his on the railing. I watched you transform from a man who controlled everything to a man who was willing to surrender everything for his daughter. That takes more courage than anything I did. She struggled for words. I wasn't just teaching you to be a father. I was learning what it means to build a family from broken pieces. And somewhere in that process, you stopped being just Damiana's father and became. She paused. Mine. You became mine too. Romano's careful approach gave her time to pull away, but Teresa rose to meet him halfway. The kiss was tender, full of months of unspoken feelings. Breaking apart, foreheads touching, Romano whispered, I don't deserve you. I don't deserve either of you. Maybe not, Teresa replied. But you're choosing to become someone who does. That's what matters. From inside, Damiana's soft crying. She'd woken from a dream. Both moved instinctively toward her, together. Romano lifted her from the crib, while Teresa soothed her with gentle words. Damiana settled immediately, secure between them. This is what family looks like, Teresa said softly. Not perfect people, but broken people choosing each other. Opening day of the Maria Ferry Crisis Center arrived with media coverage and curious onlookers. Romano's brief speech honored Maria's memory while introducing Teresa as more than just the director. She's Damiana's co-guardian and my partner in everything that matters. The doors opened to families in need. A young mother with 2 children fleeing domestic violence entered, and Teresa greeted her personally. You're safe here. I know what you're running from. I ran from it too. Romano watched, Damiana on his hip, as the little girl who'd cried inconsolably now smiled at other children. Both had been healed through love and stability. In prison, Frank Pierce received his final message from Romano's associate. Your stepdaughter and her siblings are under permanent protection. If you ever attempt to find them after your release, you become a problem we solve permanently. Frank's defeated nod meant Teresa was finally, truly free. Emma flourished at University of Rome. Tyler thrived, his trauma managed through therapy. Both helped at the center regularly. Emma asked Teresa, how did you know how to save everyone? I didn't, Teresa replied. I just kept choosing love over fear, even when I was terrified. That evening at the farmhouse, as Romano and Teresa prepared dinner in comfortable domesticity, Damiana called out clearly, Mama, Papa. Both froze. She was looking right at Teresa when she said, Mama. Teresa's tears came immediately. Romano knelt beside them. She's right, you know. That's exactly what you are. I never thought I could have this, Teresa whispered. A real family. We're all running from something, Romano said. The miracle is when we find people worth running to instead. He produced a small box. This isn't an engagement ring. Not yet. Not until you're ready. Inside was a necklace with 3 interlinked circles. This is a promise. You, me, and Damiana. 3 lives that became one family. As he placed it around her neck, Damiana between them, Teresa smiled through tears. I think I've been ready since that moment on the plane when you trusted me with your daughter. I just didn't realize it yet. So you're saying? I'm saying yes. To all of it. The adoption, the partnership, the forever. Yes. From a crying baby on an airplane to a family built from broken pieces. This is the story of how courage changes everything. Teresa risked her safety to help a stranger's child. Romano risked his empire to become a better man. And together, they proved that redemption isn't about erasing our past. It's about choosing who we become despite it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that it's never too late to choose love over fear, compassion over control, healing over hiding, then subscribe to this channel. Because every week, we bring you stories that prove the human capacity for transformation is limitless. Hit that subscribe button now and never miss another story that might change how you see the world, how you see others, or most importantly, how you see yourself. Years later, teenage Damiana stood at the center's 10th anniversary, addressing the crowd. I don't remember the plane ride where my story began. I don't remember my mother, though I've been told she would be proud of what my father and Mama Tessa built in her name. Romano and Teresa, in the audience holding hands, watched their daughter with pride. This center saved hundreds of families. But the first family it saved was mine. My father was lost, and Mama Tessa showed him how to be found. She was running, and he showed her how to stop and build something permanent. And I was grieving, and together they showed me how to be happy again. She looked directly at them. The most powerful force in the world isn't violence or money or control. It's the decision one person makes to help another, even when there's nothing in it for them. That's how we can all save someone, just by choosing compassion over indifference. As their now large family gathered, Emma with her own family, Tyler engaged, 3 more children, Damiana asked, Papa, Mama, did I do okay? Both embraced her. You reminded us why we do this, Romano said. You reminded us what we're fighting for, Teresa added. They say life can change in an instant. On an airplane over the Atlantic Ocean, 3 lives collided, a desperate father, a grieving baby, and a young woman who chose courage over safety. That instant keeps echoing forward, transforming everyone it touches. We all have those instants waiting for us, moments when we can choose to help, to risk, to love when it would be easier to look away. The question is, when your moment comes, what will you choose?